I want us to build a different world, a world without so much harm, without so much violence. When people think about gender-based violence, they often think about interpersonal violence. They focus on things like partner abuse, abuse in families, date rape. And this focus is important and essential, but it isn't enough. Building a world without violence also requires us to address the violence and harms of institutions and the state. I have spent the last decade working in the women's sector, supporting women in prison and women on the margins, women who experience institutional violence. These women have been continually let down and abandoned by society. Their experiences of the care system, of poor education, of housing, of inadequate mental health and addiction support, of economic injustice, all tell us a story of wider inequalities. A story that tells us we need to broaden our lens. We need to think about structural violence. When I say I worked for the women's sector, I'm referring broadly to the network of grassroots groups and formal organisations led by and for women, providing safe spaces and services for women. Some of these groups are issue-based, addressing things like domestic violence or housing. Others are community-focused, such as women's centres, or identity-focused, like Nigerian women's organisations. Others are advice, policy, campaigning, membership bodies. They're broadly united in a goal of challenging oppression and structural inequalities and improving rights for women. We are united in a struggle for freedom, a struggle for liberation. There are so many amazingly inspirational women and organisations fighting to keep women's services open against this difficult and hostile backdrop. In these times of austerity policies, policies that disproportionately are affecting women, demand for their services has increased by 85%, while their funding has fallen by 50%. But challenging as these times are externally, I've also become convinced that the women's sector will never be successful in our goals if we continue on the path we're currently on. We need something radically internally to change. What we're currently doing isn't working. We are facing a number of interconnected problems that prevent us from achieving our broad goals. And these problems are locking us out of the path we need to be on. So today, I'm going to talk to you about what those problems are and how they're preventing us from building the world we want. I'm going to suggest that another way is possible, that there's a key to understanding this lock. You see, the big problem is the women's sector has been co-opted. It has been swallowed up by government policies that are withdrawing support from people on the one hand, while increasing punishment and control on the other. Governments that won't build council housing, yet are building more and more prisons. There are three main problems that we need to unlock to understand this co-option. First, the character of our work has shifted from political organising to one of service provision. Second, we've become trapped in a business funding model. And third, we've become too enmeshed in the criminal justice system. So these three things together, depoliticisation, funding, and the criminal justice system, have caused the women's sector to become co-opted. The women's sector began as a grassroots movement for radical social change. Now we've largely become depoliticised service providers. So let's look at depoliticisation. We develop vital services for women, like domestic violence refuges, rape crisis centres, counselling services, and it's important to keep those services going and ensure the survival of the sector. But the problem is that we've begun to act as if those services are the solution in themselves, rather than demanding transformative social and structural change. We now think our purpose is to provide good services to respond to problems, rather than to challenge the conditions that created these problems in the first place. Service provision was and is important, but it was never meant to be the only thing, or even the main thing we did. It was supposed to be a stopgap measure on the way to radical change. Part of providing services and support was a survival strategy which grew from understanding that basic needs need to be met before people could confront the conditions causing their distress. That people need to be supported on the way to being politicised. But in focusing more and more energy on services provision for individuals, we got less political. we lost sight of our bigger goals. Part of the reason why organisations focus so much on time on service provision rather than movement building is because they have no choice under the current funding model. So let's talk about funding. Everyone agrees that funding is a problem. However, most people think the problem is a shortage of money. But vital services are being drastically cut and underfunded, and we do need to keep them going. We do need resources to meet increasing needs. But the problem is bigger than that. The problem is also about the very model of funding. The problem for the women's sector is what money does to our mission. I don't know if money changes people, but I know it can change organisations. Currently, funding primarily focuses on services, and these services primarily focus on individuals. We have bought into this notion that problems are located in individuals and solutions must also lie in individuals, focusing responsibility and services on the individuals themselves, like giving tenancy advice to a woman with no housing during a housing crisis. We are focusing on the fish rather than the water. The current funding model increasingly operates on business principles, like a competitive market. The women's sector organisations constantly have to compete for funding, and this money is tied to short-term projects and services, accompanied by lots of strings, outcomes and reporting measures. All sorts of indicators and measurements need to be met, and evidence, and endless amounts of paperwork. That's ramped up to farcical levels at the moment, often way beyond the infrastructural capacities of small voluntary sector organisations. And women receiving services begin to feel like they're being processed, and workers like they're processing. And priorities change, away from building relationships towards feeding this database. The very language being spoken in organisations changes as contract speak seeps in. What begins to count is not what actually happens, but what's on the database, what's in the report. The story about the work becomes more important than the work. When all funders seem to want is innovation, new solutions, it's hard to keep reinventing what you're doing, because meaningful change takes time and persistence, but projects are only funded for 2 to 3 years. Trust me, even reading these funding applications can take days. And the sector is forced to competing against large providers whose job it is to win money. But it goes deeper than that. It's not just that we're forced to constantly chase after money or write reports. It's that we've started to follow funders' priorities rather than following our own. Organisations reframe their work. They start doing new types of work. They start working in whole other areas to fit funder priorities. And funding, like anything, has fashion cycles. Charities are increasingly being criticised for being irrelevant, for becoming disconnected from their roots, looking more like businesses. Corporate branding, corporate language, corporate roles. Larger women's organisations are expanding and eating up money and contracts for work that was previously done by local, small, BME, led by and for organisations, who have closer ties with their communities and often a stronger critical analysis. And these smaller, community-focused organisations are being forced to the brink. We are becoming too distant. Who are we accountable to? Our funders or our movement and the people we serve? We are losing our sense of community. We are losing our sense of solidarity. And funding also affects our voice. It affects the independence of organisations, because government funding comes with gagging clauses, meaning organisations in receipt of funding can't engage in lobbying to challenge government policies. And even when it's not explicitly directed in funding contracts, organisations often self-censor for fear of being seen as biting the hand that feeds them. The government doesn't want to hear about structural critical analysis. They're not comfortable with being told their policies are causing harm and things need to change. But that's the remit of the women's sector, which is both at risk and putting them at risk. The biggest problem I see, though, is that money has trapped us on a funding carousel that limits our imagination, our independence, and narrows our vision for change. Part of the reason why our vision has become so narrow is a lot of funding is filtered through the criminal justice system. This system is organised around punishment, surveillance, and control. So those criminal justice values seep into our funding, which seeps into our women's sector, and it seeps into the work. As a result, the women's sector has become too closely entwined with the criminal justice system. So let's talk about the criminal justice system. When the women's movement started, it was generally quite sceptical about the criminal justice system because police and other government institutions didn't take women's safety seriously. So some strands of feminist movement started working with and within the criminal justice system, advocating for reforms, training the police, creating victim services, calling for changes in law to better protect women, for additional offences and increased sentence lengths. But looking back at this strategy over the last 30 years, we see that despite some gains, overall focusing on this approach hasn't worked. It hasn't actually made most women safer. Rates of domestic violence, sexual assault and domestic murders are largely unchanged. Women still struggle to access justice. And this has also contributed to the growth of the prison population. We wanted this violence to be taken seriously as a crime, and assuming we could reform sexist institutions and that the police could protect women, we organised our services aligned in the criminal justice system. And for some privileged women, this worked, but for a lot of women, it didn't work, particularly women of colour, migrant women, queer and trans women, sex workers, women with addictions and mental health problems, women from the gypsy and traveller community, women whose relationship with the police might already be strained. It only made things worse. A lot of marginalised women have increasingly been caught up in the criminal justice system itself. The women's prison population has doubled since 1993. By working so closely with the criminal justice system, we inadvertently started adopting the logics of a carceral system, logics that have hurt more women than they've helped. One of the most fundamental assumptions being that punishment is somehow supposed to be the route to bring about change, that punishment that happens after harm can prevent further harms. The criminal justice system is based on retributive justice, a law and order model that doesn't focus on prevention or give people the support they need to change. It doesn't work. Our prisons are now overcrowded, in utter crisis, violence and drugs are rife, and deaths in custody have never been higher. In arguing for punishment for abusers of women, we strengthened the criminal justice system and inadvertently supported the punishment of victims, particularly those marginalised, those who don't fit the right kind of victim narrative. We created a contradiction. We want the system to be transformative for victims, but punitive for perpetrators. The reality is it can't be those two things. It doesn't work for either victims or perpetrators. The very dichotomy of victim-perpetrator doesn't hold true. Most people who harm have already been harmed. There is a cycle of harm that lives within us, within our society, within our social relations. Dealing with the problem of violence through focusing on individuals, meanwhile overlooking the violence of the system itself and the harm it perpetrates, won't work. The problem is that our imagination as well as our movement has been co-opted. Our vision has narrowed and we need to widen it again. We need to build the world we want, not the world we think we can get. As Angela Davis said, you have to act as if it was possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. Angela Davis is a black feminist, prison abolitionist, and like others, committed to ending gender-based violence, committed to addressing harm. Abolitionists don't believe prison will ever be the means of achieving that goal because prison is part of the cycle of harm, part of state violence that must be dismantled on the path to achieving wider gender, racial, and economic social justice. And I think that feminist prison abolition is a key to helping us unlock these problems. Disruptive thinking, like feminist prison abolition, is what we need now to guard against the co-option of our social movements. Feminist prison abolition invites us to disrupt how we think. What if prisons doesn't make us safer? What if we took all or at least half the resources away from the criminal justice system and used it to prevent harm, to tackle problems at their roots? Maybe put it in things like healthcare, housing, education. Feminist prison abolition recognises that the mainstream anti-violence movement reinforces the criminal justice system by trying to stop things happening through legislation, by increasing sentence lengths, by locating all the support within the criminal justice system while the state is punishing and controlling people and defunding our welfare, while they build prisons, not houses. And you might be thinking feminist prison abolition sounds like a far-fetched idea, that we need to be realistic. But what if being realistic is actually just being complicit with the status quo? And we all know the status quo needs to change. Radical goals can help us keep our lens wide. They help us keep institutional harm as well as interpersonal harm in view, to avoid the traps of reform that don't have structural change as a goal. Having a big, bold vision like feminist prison abolition might get us where we need to go. Feminist prison abolition invites us to take a long view, to know that structures change and get dismantled, that we are part of that change, that wave of possibility that will take us to a better world. So what should we do? When we're developing strategies, we need to ask ourselves, are we prioritising providing support to survive a broken system, or is this about changing the system? We need to focus our energy on movement building, because service provision isn't enough. Finding inspiration from women who've gone before us and reaching out and harnessing and building on the enthusiasm and activism of women as they rise up now. We need to prioritise movement over money. We need to change our funding models to remember who we're accountable to. It's not that we don't want money to do the work, it's that needs to be done, but we can't continue having priorities set by governments, by foundation trusts, by wealthy philanthropists. The system is working for them, they don't need it to change. We need to develop solutions outside the criminal justice system. We need to focus as much energy, if not more, into building strong communities. We ourselves, you and me, need to support and build capacity for everyone to address violence. We need more focus on transformative justice principles. As Insight, Women of Colour Against Violence say, the revolution will not be funded. We will never gain freedom of oppression through a system which is itself oppressive. We will never gain liberation from a system designed to take freedom. And we will never free ourselves from harm through a system that is harmful. Working towards inclusion, connection and belonging as our primary goal, and centering the most marginalised, we seek to build solutions that are not reliant on our current systems of criminal justice funding. We build other ways of caring for each other. We imagine a world without prison. We work towards that as our goal. And together we can make the world we want. Thank you.